back, everybody. This is another episode of TrekWars at OSU. That's Oregon State University. My name is Joseph Orosco. I'm a professor of philosophy at Oregon State University, and I'm the co-director of the Anarres Project for Alternative Futures. TrekWars at OSU is our regular podcast series in which we talk about the ways in which we can use major sci-fi franchises like Star Trek, Star Wars, and others to help us think about relevant social, political, economic issues of the day. And today I am joined by a guest, one of our favorite guests, one of my favorite guests, a regular for the Anarres Project. He's done writing for us before, and he's appeared on one of our podcasts before, talking about the best of science fiction for 2021. I'm joined today by Dr. Jason Scully. He is assistant professor in urban and regional planning at Eastern Washington University. Jason, thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the representation of race and mental health in season 2 of Picard. So season 2 of Picard just finished up. We want to note first, before we get much further along, that we are going to be talking about various kinds of spoilers. And so if you haven't watched season 2 of Picard yet, you might want to hold off in our discussion until you've seen the storyline. There's going to be spoilers talked about. The other thing to talk about is that because of the subject matter of season 2, I wanted to provide a content warning for some of the things that we might discuss in the episode today. Season 2 of Picard portrays a lot of mental health trauma and also portrays suicide. So just to let folks know, we will be talking about some of these issues during our discussion today. And the other thing is just to note that even though we're talking about the representation of mental health in season 2 of Picard, neither of us are mental health specialists. So this is not an area of expertise necessarily, but we're going to focus more, I think, instead on the representations of mental health, mental illness, and also particularly questions about trauma, intergenerational trauma, and representations of intelligence and genius, and how those influence the way that the characters have been structured in Star Trek Picard season 2 in particular. So we're going to start by talking about race and representation in Star Trek Picard. But we're going to talk a little bit about season 1, because I know, Jason, you've had some, in conversations that we've had, you told me that you have pretty strong opinions about the way in which Rafi was introduced in season 1, and I want to hear, whether you think that some of these issues have been resolved or have not been resolved for Rafi in season 2. But tell me, what is your concern about the way that Rafi as a character was introduced in season 1?
Well, first off, I think we need to contextualize what we're talking about here in terms of the fact that both you and I are white passing people of color, where people might see us and not know our family histories. My mother is Black, my father is white. I ended up looking more like my Irish American father than I do like my mother or my mother's family. But that doesn't remove me from Black experiences or connecting with Black people on a different level than other people might. So when I look at a show like Picard, I'm looking through a very specific lens, a lens that's probably only possible for somebody who's lived with one foot in both the Black world and the white world, while also being perceived as white. Anyway, I think that's really important to frame my perspective in this. So then to dive right in, I think that the representation of Rafi has been bullshit. I have been so angry with who Rafi is. Let's start with you. What did you think of Rafi? Because I can go down some dark roads with this.
Yeah, well, season. So in general, let me say, we did I did a Trek Wars, I think a year ago or a couple of whenever Picard season one first premiered. I did a couple of videos, I think, on our channel in which I discussed different kinds of issues coming out of season one. And in general, I would say I really liked season one of Picard. I thought
Mhm.
that the story was interesting. I think that what in particular I liked is I thought that there was some decent character development, and I thought the whole sort of arc with Data was interesting, right? In some sense of trying to think about issues of mortality and immortality. And I like the introduction of characters of like Rafi, Elnor, um, Agnes, and
Mhm.
Rios. So I like this new batch of characters that came along. But I noted, right, in particularly when talking about Rafi, right, that there were a lot of people that were um, concerned about the representation of this character, right, as a black woman who is trying to compensate for one, her quote unquote failures as a mother, and the undistinguished way in which she was released from Starfleet because of the attack on Mars, is living in the desert in a trailer, seemingly hooked on smoking some kind of alien weed. And so, the image of this is as a very sort of perhaps a very stereotypical representation of angry black women.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to see how you felt about that. I've seen those kinds of discussions go on, and I wanted to see whether you felt one that was that matches what you saw going on with Rafi, and whether or not you think that they rehabilitated Rafi in any sort of decent way for season two that sort of overcame those limitations on her character.
Yeah. I start out with my emotions, like and I realize, oh, I need to roll it back in, and I need to allow for people to have different feelings. And I know that um, you enjoyed Picard a lot more, so I want to respect that and build off that when I say I think this is bullshit. Because I don't like something doesn't mean other people do. It's like strawberry ice cream. Strawberry ice cream exists for a reason because there's 30% of the population who's brain damaged and thinks strawberry ice cream tastes good. Uh, I'm joking. I'm so joking. And I realize it's ableist talk and I need to watch myself. But um, what I don't like about Raffi is the imagery. I don't like the use of a black woman in a black body to tell a story that we're still trying to move white America past. We're trying to say no. Black women can be so much more, and that there's this whole range of things. So why would we go back to a stereotype of a black mother whose child's been taken away from her, who's lost everything, and who's drug addicted? This is bullshit, and it's it's really unfair to black community that were finally introduced to Starfleet officers of color who are going to take a front row seat to the action, to female Starfleet officers of color in particular. We did get Benjamin Sisko, but and then to have her be so complicated and so messed up. Uh, and then we get Rios. And I know things get complicated when it comes to Latin Americans and race. So is he a person of color? Is he not? Eh, let's. He's still a structurally oppressed minority group when he's outside of Chile, when he's in the United States. Uh, and so we need to consider his reputation. And his reputation is he's an alcoholic, antisocial dropout who is smoking cigars, which is probably really, really bad 400 years from now, not just a little bad. It's like he's cosplaying and just he's just being a big weirdo. And so we get these two structurally oppressed characters who have this very important potential to represent stuff for current viewers today. And instead, we see them as really messed up human beings and messed up in a society that we have been told from all the previous episode iterations of Star Trek is perfect. So if we have a perfect society and we have two brown black people who can't fit into the perfect society, what does it tell us about black brown people? It makes me angry.
Yeah, I mean, so the sort of assessment I think of Discovery and Picard over the years has been that there's a lot of focus on trauma and overcoming trauma, and in some sense, all of the characters on Picard have this traumatic backstory. Right, Agnes, killed her lover, and has deals with these feelings of imposter syndrome and inadequacy. And then of course season 2 of Picard is all about the intergenerational trauma that has motivated Picard all of his life. And so all of these characters are particularly damaged, and that seems to be an important functional element of this story. And so I think that Picard is trying to say something about those issues for us today, and is representing what they consider to be characters that would speak to issues in the 21st century in a kind of way. The concern, of course, that I think that part of what we want to talk about today is the way in which those representations are more about us than they are about the sort of lived reality of those characters in that universe, in a way that creates too much disbelief in what's
Mhm.
going on in there. So I guess what I would say is that I think that it's something to be said about trying to discuss these issues in a sci-fi franchise like this. But does the way in which it presents these issues and represents the characters do so in a way that's helpful for us to be able to appreciate and understand the nuances of these kinds of issues like race representation and intergenerational trauma and mental health crises? And so even though, as I said, I liked Picard season 1, season 2 was a big hot mess. In particular, I think in these kinds of representation, one of race and one of mental health trauma. So, for me, I'm, when thinking about Rafi, I mean, I do feel problematic about this sort of, I think that the representation, as you pointed out, is problematic for her. And in season 2, she's still a mess. She's very unconfident. She's not sure about her relationship with Seven. She's always sort of like after Seven in a way, like, how are we? Are we okay? She's definitely like, the needy one in
Mhm.
this relationship. She's always never sure where she stands, and she's always waiting for Seven's approval.
Yeah.
And then there's that storyline with Elnor that she sort of like hijacked his career in a way to satisfy herself, to fill that void in her of the loss of her son. And so there's just she realizes that at the end, I think in the show, and it's unclear where she is with. I guess her and Seven are good in their relationship at the end. It's clear that Seven is the one driving this relationship, though. Right, she seems to be the dominant personality in the relationship.
Yeah.
Rafi is just sort of like trying to hold on to her, make sure she doesn't run away. Rafi is always just very scared that everyone is going to abandon her. And so I think that I don't know if they have repaired the representation of the angry black woman who is really needy, scared, and afraid, and vulnerable. I don't know if they repaired that in season 2.
Yeah. I don't think they did. But I think it's signs of bigger problems with everything that happened on the show. I mean, but I do want to say that hell hath no fury. Um, sorry. Just
Nice, nice, nice.
let's go back to my um I the Rafi Seven relationship was totally unearned. And that, for me, that last episode of season one where they hook up, kind of made me angry because it wasn't in any way earned. There wasn't any build up, any tension. It felt like a cheap shot. It felt like like the writers trying to appeal to as many audiences as they could, and then to do it in a way where they could just accidentally delete that clip when they send it to China for the Chinese audiences. Um, so I was set up to be annoyed by the Rafi Seven relationship, and then when we see it a year later, um, and they've gone their own ways, and so we're having to pick up the pieces again. It still, it didn't feel authentic, it didn't feel earned, and so yeah, we don't get to know why Rafi would feel needy and Seven would feel distant, um, which might actually be good writing because we're having to do the work ourselves, but it wasn't worth the effort, and there was never any stake in their relationship because we never were invested in it unless we did the work ourselves between seasons. Um, so
Yeah,
it just
I feel that same way. I feel like I would like to see like where this is going, and apparently there's discussion maybe about like a now that right. So Picard has one more season, then it'll be done. But maybe there will be a storyline that gets picked up of Seven and Rafi afterwards. So there's discussion about that. I've heard online, some chatter. I don't know. There, it's true that certain characters are not showing up again in Star Trek Picard season 3. Namely, Elnor is not coming back. Girardi is not coming back, and Rios is not coming back. So we've lost some major characters. So who knows where that will take Rafi and Seven. Um, speaking again then about like representation of characters of color, Rios. So the what happens to Rios for me is really hard to believe. What happens in season 2, and so you point out in season 1 he's represented as this kind of drunken, piratey, verging on pirate kind of character, and we learn is that he's doing this as a result of trauma that he suffered during Starfleet as well, so very similar to Rafi in this sense, and he feels betrayed by Starfleet. So season 2 opens up and he's the captain of his own ship, right? He kind of rehabilitated, and so he's still got his swagger, right? He's got his cigar on the bridge, even though he never lights it, but he's got it there. So you see him brought back into the fold of Starfleet, but what happens to him during season 2 is also fairly traumatic because, as you point out, right, he's a Latinx person put into 21st century America, and that means being structurally oppressed. And you see him, being apprehended and assaulted and tortured by the 2024 version of Homeland Security. You see him thrown into an ICE jail. So kudos for them for trying to think about ways to speak to forces of structural oppression in our current world, right, and representing those as problematic. So that's Star Trek's DNA in some sense. But despite of the fact that Rios has suffered all this other trauma, none of that, what he's experienced in the 21st century, seems to be traumatic for him. He sort of overcomes the fact that he got like tasered and beat up by ICE to sort of sit around and going, "Wow, this is a great century. I think I want to stay here now." And it's like this, just like he admits, that he calls it at one point a barbarous time. And then by the end of it, he's decided that he wants to hang out and start a family in the 21st century, knowing, I would imagine, that of course World War III and all this stuff is just down the road, and he decides, yeah, I think I'm going to start a family under these kinds of circumstances.
yeah. I just so much of the show is so incomprehensible. My best guess, because I thought way too much about this, is that the writers had a whole series of issues. Maybe on their writer board, they wrote down on post-it notes, we need to talk about trauma. We need to talk about LGBT plus issues. We need to make sure that we're representing this. We need to talk about these issues. And so they tried to write a story around issues instead of a story around characters and plots. Story to write a story around story, basically. So there's no direct hero's journey, and the one hero's journey that there is, Picard's journey to uncover his trauma, is strung out over like 10 episodes where we get these little minor things, and then we have whole episodes that are just placeholder episodes. Like there's the episode where Girardi's been taken over by the Borg Queen, and all we get is Rafi and Seven of Nine talking to some people and figuring out that she went to go hang out with Soon. Like the whole episode is we figured out that she went from here to there. And oh, by the way, we get to find out more of Seven of Nine's trauma, which again, also not earned. Or if it was earned, it was earned in it was earned in Voyager, and so we're just having to count on having watched Voyager to feel it. And I don't quite buy that because Voyager, Voyager is my least favorite Star Trek by far. Ugh. I um I just wanted to get back to I wanted them to get back to the Alpha Quadrant so they could have real missions instead of dragging us along. Um Seven, the Seven of Nine who was getting deprogrammed, literally and figuratively, from the Borg Collective, um, saw the benefits and the strengths of being Borg. And so you had to wonder, um, just how traumatizing and really bad is it to be Borg? And what did Seven of Nine lose from her not being Borgness? And so in this Picard series, um, being former Borg is seen as this horrible trauma where you're violated in every aspect of your being, and yet you get the sense that maybe from the original series that maybe there are some strengths to being a Borg. And when there's an episode of Voyager where they go to a planet full of people who'd been kidnapped from the Alpha Quadrant, and they're like, "Hey, what's up? You're a Vulcan, and you're in the Gamma Quadrant." And you find out, oh, these are Borg who got disconnected from the collective, and their big mission is to create a separate hive mind free of the Borg. You're like, oh, maybe the Borg isn't so bad. So I I didn't like a lot of the very black and white, good bad, um, framing of the show rather than having nuances and characters developing organically within the constraints of the Star Trek universe. I think what these writers did is they started with issues, and then they had these id-driven characters who were going from plot point to plot point based on emotional responses, which underlies the whole problem of the series. I think is we got these issues that need to be hit, and then we have characters who are reacting to emotions rather than thinking things out in a thoughtful, logical, nuanced way.
That's interesting, right? I think because one of the things I did like about season two was perhaps about it sort of mentioning issues, but then don't sort of follow through with them or don't see that they impact the characters in any big way. So the series begins by looking at they find themselves thrown back into 2024 Los Angeles, and they find themselves in the middle of a sanctuary zone. Like, so this is one of those big themes from DS9, from the episodes past tense 1 and 2, where you find that in the early 21st century, the United States was at this crucial point where they were essentially like putting concentration camps of homeless and unemployed people in every major city. So that gets, that theme is brought back into Picard, and they find themselves in the Los Angeles sanctuary zone, and it looks just like a houseless camp that you would find today somewhere in downtown LA. And so I like that sort of like, oh, that's interesting. They're sort of updating this theme, but then that goes nowhere.
Yeah.
Right. They don't talk about the sanctuary zones other than to acknowledge that they're there. There's this really hyped up militarized ICE that's there. And then they run into Guinan. So
The point
the
is for them
Guinan.
to react to everything.
Yes, that's right.
Everything is there for them to react. and then they're going to have an emotional reaction, and we're supposed to, the viewers, be swept into the emotional reaction and go along with it.
And I think that I was swept up in that, especially there was this one, my favorite line, I think, of the whole sort of thing is when Picard meets the young Guinan and is trying to sort of figure out who she is, try to get her to recognize him. And he's trying to understand like why she's so angry, right? So here again, another angry black woman, in LA in 2024. And she's so angry because she's sort of seen what humanity has done for the past, say, 200 years, she says. And there's this line where she says, what's happened in this century, the 21st century, is that people have, she says something like, before, a century ago, they all wore white sheets. Now they've taken out their white sheets and wear business suits. And I was like, oh my God, wow, that's some heavy hitting kind of social commentary. And then that's it. And then the rest of it is like Rios is like, I'd love to live here. So it's like, wow, like the sort of like the sense that this is a problematic century, right, seems to not impact the characters and their development in any kind of way. And so, as you said, it's sort of just like setting and showing for them to reflect back on their own trauma in a kind of way. Maybe it's because they realize, well, I can't do anything about this. This was all in the past anyways. So maybe that's it. But for the viewer, it was just like, wow, like they pointed out all these really shitty things about the present. Like, is there any kind of sense of like what the future offers as an alternative to this? And I just didn't see any of that going anywhere. It was sort of like it was there as setting, characters react to it, and then we move on from it.
Yeah. Everything was set up to be an emotional response. All of Seven of Nine's Borg trauma was set up for her to have a really negative emotional response, and rather than a more thoughtful, nuanced, and maybe that's a good depiction of trauma. As you're walking along, everything's fine, you see something, and you have an emotional response that you have a hard time managing. Which my personal trauma right there is like, I'm fine, and then I'm not fine all of a sudden. How that happened? Oh, I was triggered by this thing. But these are Starfleet officers. And everything, every Star Trek that we've seen previous has shown that these are people who have been trained to manage the they in Star Trek language, they say you manage your emotions and you know that you have to get the job done and you're able to work around it. But in 2022 terms, they've managed their triggers. Red Letter Media has been hate watching every episode of Picard, and for me, the best of Picard has been watching them hate watch, and they interspliced all these episodes where the original the Next Generation crew is being grown-ups and managing their emotions and acting from a place of rationality, with everybody in Picard being a child and responding to their emotions. I think I need to change my language here a little bit, that there are trauma responses, and having a trauma response doesn't make you a child. But then there are also responses where, no, there are things where you have to be a grown-up. So, and these people weren't necessarily acting like grown-ups, and I'm conflating trauma responses, and I don't want to do that. But the writing is so bad in this show that it's hard not to.
Right. Well, let's talk about a little bit about that, because I think that the ways in which the mental health issues, mental health trauma was represented was, for me, problematic. So one thing is like there's the racial representations of these characters. One, I think just to sort of sum up what we were talking about. For me, Rafi's character doesn't rehabilitate the stereotype criticism in season 2. Second of all, Rios, the thing that pisses me off is that Rios is gone now. So quite frankly, we don't have a major Latinx character in the Star Trek universe now. right, in that kind of way, right? So Rios was one of, we've had Latinx captains, but they were sort of like one or two episode, people. We've had some characters who were Latinx, but Rios was to be sort of like this placeholder for the first kind of Latinx captain. Now we don't have him because he decided that Starfleet was not for him, and he would rather go back and have a family in the 21st century, and then have his character arc end because he had a bar fight in Morocco. Like,
Yeah,
I don't know, I think that it was a really a mistreatment of Black and Latinx characters in Picard in that kind of way. But similarly for trauma and mental health. So here's my thing about the sort of Picard storyline is that it was one of the most cliched kinds of representations of mental health crisis and trauma that I can imagine. To me, when I was looking at this when I first saw these episodes, like Picard's mom and her being locked up in a room, it was just like this is like such Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte kind of gothic, and the way that everything is filmed in these sort of dark dungeons, it was so gothicy. And I was like trying to figure out, like, is this the way that it really happened? These are Picard's memories, or is this like some kind of, like made up trauma memory? And I guess it turns out that that was actually how it went down. And so, but
yeah,
it's represented in these kind of like most cliched, tropey sorts of ways that just kind of like, this is just so, this is just, the seriousness of dealing with like her mental health issues got sort of overlaid into this kind of storytelling techniques that come from, 19th century Gothic novels. And so I was just like, this is so stereotypical.
yeah. This is another thing that just had me my blood boiling. I love Star Trek. I hate watched every episode of Picard, but she the depiction of Picard's mother's mental illness is as this silent monster that randomly stalks us for no apparent reason, and you have no idea why. And then Picard's trauma from his mother then gets framed as his personal trauma, and you don't know why. And it's sort of this mystery piece. So we're never quite clear with Picard's mother, or actually Renee Picard too, for that matter. Is Are these mental illnesses, which maybe it's depression, maybe it's not. We're not going to say. Um, we don't ever get to know how much of this is environmental and family structures related, and how much of this is faulty brain wiring related. And in either case, we're living like Star Trek. It takes place in this future where both of these problems have been solved. So why is this an issue? And I think this is an issue because the writers, creators of Star Trek are people who are heavily invested in our neoliberal status quo, where we see everybody as having individual flaws and individual things, that individual quirks that need to be fixed, and that's not controlled by external forces. Because if we acknowledge that there are things outside of our control, then we're saying, hey, well, maybe we need to have some collective um, solution to these problems, and collective solution to these problems means government. And if you're anti-government because you're more for free trade and unregulated commerce, which is neoliberalism, then you're gonna look for personal responsibility instead of external responsibility. Um,
Yeah, I like that. I mean, I think that that's very true in the way that you see this story depicted. Is that, I mean, on the one hand, so we were talking about the sort of, what would be the structures around mental health issues in the Star Trek universe that seem to be missing from this, that makes it an individual trauma. Like on the one hand, so the story goes is that Picard's mother had some kind of form of depression, perhaps, some major sort of disassociative kinds of things that made her and gave her sort of suicidal ideation. So severe mental health kinds of questions. But you know, one, the sort of like response to that was that her husband locked her in a bedroom to prevent her from harming herself. And there's sort of some kind of vague mention that she refused treatment. But in the 24th century, like like I mentioned before, like throwing the wife in the basement and locking the door, that's like Jane Eyre, right? That's like 19th century solutions to mental health issues. Here we're talking, some 300 years later, and they're still doing the same thing. That's the best you can do, is lock your wife in the room. There's no one you can call. That seems not Star Trekky, right? In the sense that you would think that there would be systems in place for mental health care. After all, I think in several episodes of the original series, there's mention that mental health has really been something that they pay attention to in the Federation. There's all these different kinds of um, treatments for mental health issues, and in fact, I think in one of them they're talking about like eliminating some of the last really sort of like pathological, social pathological kinds of um, remaining Federation citizens. The whole sort of story of Garth of Isar. So
Yeah.
TOS is pointing out how mental health was something that the Federation really put a lot of resources to. In Discovery, right? If you're thinking about the timeline in that way, so much focus on trauma. And trying to overcome that and working through that. And one of the greatest things about for me of Discovery is Dr. Hugh, right? Wilson Cruz's character on Discovery, one of my favorite characters. Not only is he a beautiful man, he is so sympathetic as the Doctor, right? And is really reaching to try to help people understand their trauma. And then, of course, Next Generation, right? They have counselors as bridge personnel. So, there's this whole sort of like represented in the Star Trek universe, a whole sort of like structure of mental health support. But was this missing for Picard's family? Like, why wasn't that accessed for his mother? Unless, here's my only thing, unless that Picard's family is a weird kind of like anti-technological cult. That's why they still dress in the 24th century like they're 19th century peasants. That they're totally again. And that Maurice, right, their dad was so anti-Starfleet. The only thing I can think of is that there's something screwed up with that family, that they were like Luddites of the 24th century and refused. It wasn't that she refused that treatment; is that family sort of like refused to get with the 24th century. That's the only way I can sort of explain like why that story of Picard's mother went down the way it did, because it would seem that there would be so much more support in that kind of world than there is. So perhaps it speaks to the way in which there's no support now in the 21st century. You can imagine that story happening now, but 300 years from now, why would that still be happening?
Well, even now, stories like this don't necessarily happen as much when the family has means. So I do love the idea that dressing like a Victorian child is the 24th century version of the prairie dress. So there's some sort of Amish Mennonite sect that somehow stuck in 1910 America or 1910 Europe. But today, I think no mental health professional would say involuntary confinement is a acceptable treatment. I think they'd say under the very rarest of circumstances should someone be held against their will, like locked in a room. And then if you were to lock somebody in a room, you would not have the child present. And Daddy Picard could have sent baby Picard anywhere on the freaking planet instantaneously through teleporter technology. Somewhere on the planet, somewhere on this magical, better Earth than the one we live in, there is on-demand childcare. I just assume that. So there's absolutely no reason for Picard to be there. There's probably like some sort of calculus camp he could have gone to, or some sort of like any sort of drop-in program. Hell, I would even accept the 24th century Awana's overnight meeting. Just if Daddy Picard was a good father, the first thing he would do was get his son the frick out of there and away from a mother whose mental health is deteriorating, and then lock her in the closet. No.
Right. Well, that seems true. There's like there's sort of like there's lacking kind of childcare, but also so here's the thing, right? The whole sort of storyline of season two is presenting the fact that Picard has this overwhelming sense of guilt that he felt that he contributed to his mother's death,
Mhm.
and that he's lived with this all his life, and that in some sense, I think the sense is that him as a hero, going out, all of the stuff that we saw in Next Generation, his heroism, his sense of duty, his sense of trying to be someone who assists other people in the exploration of the galaxy, all of that is supposed to derive from this feeling of inadequacy that he felt that he wasn't able to help his mother. So he's compensated all of his life for that one traumatic event. And so,
It,
it's an interesting storyline, I suppose. But the thing is, I often wonder is like, well, wait a minute. So after young Picard found his mother dead, he got no mental health help
yes,
after that.
yes,
It would seem like the first thing that like Federation Child Services would have like swooped in and like taken him for counseling or something or other. But instead,
yeah.
it sort of left that like you're sort of left that he was just there with his dad, and they had to sort of process their emotions with one another. And it's already very clear that this family is weird, sort of anti-technology, weird Luddites already. Um, that just seems like, if anything, this should be a story about child abuse. It seems like Picard got
Yeah.
abused by his father. And that's the other thing is like they try to rehabilitate like Maurice to try to give him a sense that, I think Picard says at one point, in his memories, like when he sees what happened, that how his dad was trying to protect him from his mother, he sort of says, "Oh, I maybe perhaps I had you wrong," right, to his dad, because he always was resentful toward his dad. And so there's this kind of rehabilitation of the father, as maybe he was actually trying to do something right here. And I think that that's just I think that the character still is a bad person, right? He always abused Jean-Luc about wanting to explore. He seems to have been a kind of like a link that made Picard and his brother resentful and fighting with one another. And then, he incarcerated his wife in the bedroom because of mental health issues. So that doesn't seem like a healthy relationship to try to rehabilitate in any kind of way.
It, it's about I think that they were writing around characters, but not fully fledged characters. They're writing around this idea of these characters responding to these things, which is might be good for provoking emotion, but it wasn't thought through in any way that's reasonable or helpful or that really allows the characters to grow. Just like
Well, so and one thing I wanted to get to is because there was the thing that you had mentioned before that part of what you see here is a representation of mental health as an individualistic problem that people have to overcome by their own bootstraps or something. There seems to be no support for anybody in this world to
yeah,
deal with mental health, which doesn't seem to be in line with the way in which we've sort of understood mental health to be represented in the Star Trek universe up to Picard. But look, Rafi is traumatized. She deals with it with drugs, right? Rios is traumatized. He is a loner alcoholic on La Serena. And so
mhm,
now we get to see like, Picard's trauma, and it's this sort of story of like him individually dealing with the fact that there was no support for him all his life. And so no character has received any kind of structural support for their mental health, and the traumatic experiences that they've had. This is a very, as you put it, a very sort of neoliberal kind of story that that there's no kind of world in which we can help one another about these kinds of issues. It's all something that you got to just do by yourself. And of course, if you don't have the means to do that, well, then you're stuck with that kind of trauma forever.
yeah.
So that it's not a kind of utopia for mental health in any kind of way. But
I mean,
around that sort of thing too is that you were pointing out before about questions about genius in Star Trek. That genius is also portrayed in a very odd way, kind of like the sort of mirror story about mental health. That the genius, particularly in the way that Girardi is represented, is something that you had some concerns with.
oh yeah. Um, it's there's these two types of mental illness here. There's sort of Picard's uh, dealing with his mother, not having any support for managing this, which completely retcons everything we know about him up to this date in a way that's really not flattering or not. It makes the Star Trek universe yuckier. Um, and then there's his mother's whatever she's going through, which seems to be this feral, out of control. Um, Something is wrong on this fundamental deep level. Not, oh, she's having to process her own thing. So her mental illness is seen as some sort of rare congenital disease. She won the crap lottery and got dealt a bad hand, mixing metaphors here. And then we see the same thing with genius. So genius is the flip side of mental illness in terms of Girardi being this one in hundreds of billions person, this person who the Borg Queen can connect with. And the Borg Queen assimilated Guinan's race. You would think that the Borg Queen has met and assimilated her share of geniuses. So what makes Girardi so different? And then we also have Rene Picard, who's this intersection between mental health and genius, where she can do everything. She's sailing around the world at 12. She speaks 15,000 languages. She's the most amazing human being on the planet. And she's suffering from mental illness. Isn't that a twist? Isn't that? And it's just like, no, this is bullshit interpretations of things um, uh, that are useful for telling stories, and they're useful for us as viewers saying, you can't achieve anything near what Rene Picard could because you're just a dud normie. Um, I think stories of genius are often meant to put us in our places as normal underachievers. What, you only speak one language? You're just a loser. And it's like, no, most Americans just speak one language, and it has more to do with the fact that our school system doesn't prioritize learning other languages. It also has to do with the fact that we don't have to step outside our doors and speak other languages like you do in India, where you just, it makes sense if you're going to travel around India to know a couple of different languages. Um, it's this framing of certain people as being special and either exalted, or special and the opposite of exalted. Uh, and then the rest of us are just sort of knocking around. Rather than Star Trek's original democratizing message from the original series onwards of everybody gets a chance to be special and unique in their own way. That it's Marxist. It's everybody has their abilities and their talents to fit in, and in this post scarcity society where we're taking care of everything, where when your mom has a mental breakdown, yeah, you get to go to a camp for a little while, and not have to deal with it. Maybe you learn a new skill. Maybe you learn another language. It's like, yeah. Oh, my dad sent my mom away. My dad sent me away when my mom was having that mental health breakdown, and he didn't want me to be near it. And that's when I took the time to learn to learn Hindi. So now I'm fluent in Hindi because I had this moment. So as much as I'd rather spend that time with my mom, I did this thing. And then when I came back, my mom had gone to the Vulcan mind meld center to deal with her trauma in a way that was visually pleasing for TV, but solved her problem, and we'll never talk about that again, which is how they dealt with these problems in Next Generation.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think that, this. So I think it was something that's been bothering me a little bit, and I'm starting to see this a little bit in Strange New Worlds, even though we haven't really. We're talking mostly here about Picard, but sort of representations of Starfleet as like this ultra competitive institution to belong to that only geniuses can belong to. And and so yes, Star Trek, Starfleet represents the best of humanity in this kind of sense. But I always understood that, meaning that the Federation is a utopia in the sense that all people are living their best lives in some way or another. And that what makes Star Trek good is not that it's like the group of geniuses working things out, but that they are really competent people who can work together to solve problems, and not that this is the place that filters out everyone else and only gets the geniuses to work together. And so I'm starting to see that kind of aspect being portrayed in Star Trek, and it's a little bit troublesome. And maybe that's why Rios decides that Starfleet's not for him, is because he
Yeah,
decides that this is a bullshit neoliberal organization, right?
that
That claims that we're there to help people, but it's not. I mean, and that is kind of a story that you get out of season 1 about the Federation and Starfleet, is that they are a lot of talk, but they're willing to let entire species die because of old grudges, and so they're not quite as utopic as possible. And so part of what Picard is doing is peeling away at the kinds of utopian elements that we thought existed in Starfleet. There's that one sort of thing that I think in DS9, the remark that out on the edges of the Federation, things are not so utopic, but back on Earth, everything's a utopia. I think what season 1 and season 2 of Picard is showing, that there's not even utopia on Earth. It's still this kind of place where you sort of, as an individual, you either make it or break it, and no one is going to help you. And that seems like a step back in the representation of the Star Trek utopia.
that for me is the failing with all these new Trek efforts since J.J. Abrams, is that people aren't perfected in the J.J. Abrams world, and society is not perfected. And in the Roddenberry interpretation, yeah, we've created this society that has allowed everyone to elevate, and everyone's being their best self. And so everyone is responding to crises and situations by stopping, acknowledging their feelings. There's a lot of feeling acknowledgement in Next Generation, but it's framed around, okay, we're going to be scientists and we're going to explore this and we're going to remove our bias from the situation as we solve this problem. And we're going to kind of listen to our bias a little bit because maybe there's some truth there, but we're going to do it in this structured way. And I think that's, for so many of us, that was such an exciting change from shoot from your hip American diplomacy, which ironically is what Captain Kirk is best known for. Um, we love this idea of this rational, let's move forward future, and then we get Spock and Data there to show this the extremes of what happens if we rely too much on rationality. And then Abrams onwards, it's a whole bunch of people acting out their ids in a giant technological playground, uh, and that has kind of ruined it for me. But it also sort of ruins the society behind it too. You can't have a utopian society that's perfecting everybody if everyone's id driven. So you end up with these depictions of the Federation that are kind of evil, kind of corrupt, kind of doing things like letting Riker and Troy's son die because we're not going to engage in these technologies. Um, it just it feels fake. Or a friend of mine on Facebook pointed this out when I was ranting about Picard on there, is that life aboard Starfleet ships might be like life on a military base, where everything is idealized and everything to some extent is this more fair, perfect, regimented society. So yeah, the Starfleet, Starbase, people living in Starfleet are living the utopia, but everyone else is living in reality.
Well, see that's the thing I worry about, the so I can sort of see that, right? Is that that Starfleet is the cream of the crop, and everything that happens there is like a step removed from ordinary people. If that's true, then I think it makes things less interesting for me in terms of the Star Trek universe, because I always sort of understood it as like these are good people, but they have they have come from a humanity itself that has evolved in some kind of special way. And what was really exciting for me was always to see like what would happen when like Cisco would come back to New Orleans,
Mhm.
and hang out with his dad and to see what was going on there. Right, there's this restaurant, it's flourishing, they're enjoying this great cuisine, and no one is paying any money for
Yeah.
this kind of stuff, right? It's and so there's this kind of real sense that things are different in the Federation, not just in Starfleet, but in the Federation. Humanity has changed. And you get glimmers of that still in various ways, but then there's these kinds of suggestions that Starfleet is totally different or better, even more so than regular humanity back on Earth. And that seems that sort of disconnection kind of explains like what's going on with Picard and his family, I guess. But it then reinforces this kind of view that these problems are things that you just have to deal with yourself individually, and that there's no sort of social structures we can build to make things easier for people to deal with their trauma. It's all a matter of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, be the genius, and overcome your feelings, overcome your trauma by yourself, maybe with one helpful counselor, but there's nothing else to help you there. And that seems like a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, I mean, and we're dealing with a universe where there are planets full of telepaths, and we can't solve these problems.
Right.
And it's sort of the whole this whole neoliberalism of not being able to figure out how things happen. So every crisis we face in our society is no one could have seen that coming because no one wanted to see that coming because that would have involved a collective action, which our societies don't want to do. And then we put our faith in superhumans. Like for better or worse, we voted Elon Musk a superhuman. I saw something on TV where they were comparing him to Tony Stark, um, who was a literal super. Well, he had the super suit, but yeah, he's still superhuman. Um, and it's so fundamentally disturbing that this is what we've decided to go with and roll with, is that there are some people who are super special who are going to save us, and things just randomly happen and you can't control them, like Picard's mother's mental illness,
Mm.
versus the no, we can have a logical rational plan, we can think these things through, we can even figure out how to balance our emotional responses to these things because we're not Vulcans and we're not androids. um, versus no, we're gonna not realize that there are causes. We're gonna assume that there are superhumans and that there are super mental illnesses, and we're gonna respond emotionally to these situations. Uh,
Yeah. Well, I
maybe
mean,
I,
to be fair, in a certain kind of sense, I'm thinking about this now and the way that we're talking about this. I mean, I think that in some sense, what we're seeing right now in mid 2022, in response, for instance, to the COVID global pandemic, I think we're seeing the sort of same responses. Like, there's nothing collectively we can do. Let's get rid of any kinds of mask mandates. Let's ignore any kind of collective action. If you're concerned about getting infected, then take care of yourself. It's an individual problem, not a social problem, not a public health issue. It's a private issue that you should be concerned with if that's something that you're worried about. So wear a mask, but we don't talk about, right? We've lost the kind of sense that this is a collective problem that we all need to pull together with now. It's a matter of like, take care of yourself if you can. So in
mhm.
some sense, we've abandoned the kind of image of, let's work together as humanity to solve a common problem. It's become a individual issue that you can worry about if you so wish to, if you believe that there's a problem in the first place. And that seems to be what's going on, being represented in the Star Trek universe around mental health, is the same sort of response that we're now facing, perhaps with disastrous consequences, to COVID. Right, we're inured to the massive amount of death and suffering that's taken place, and it's become now a matter of just like, take care of yourself.
Yeah, it's the Texas energy grid. It's the fact that they had that disastrous winter, and we're going into a disastrous summer for Texas. And everyone in power in Texas is saying, "Well, nobody saw that happening. How could this? I don't get it." While they're taking away taxpayer dollars that are paying for this grid that's failing. Um, it's the fact that we could have been investing into alternate. Well, I'm going to blame Europe for this one. We dishonor our own country enough. Europe could have been really working harder on disinvesting from fossil fuels because they saw what was going on in Russia. and now look where they are at. This like and the neoliberals are all going, well, nobody could have seen that coming, and it's like, no, people saw this coming. It's when our cities really start to flood, when Florida really starts to experience the effects of climate change. Nobody saw this coming.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, so it's sort of like it reiterates your point in some sense that we seem to be losing the ability to think, uh, to envision a kind of humanity that can think rationally about, like the kind of stuff that you do professionally, which is thinking about planning, thinking about having rational structures in place for our built and lived systems. Star Trek is sort of doesn't fill in that picture or currently with its storyline. It's sort of adopting the status quo mindset of 21st century America, which is pretty much there's nothing we can do about these issues. Solve it on your own, and if disaster happens, then we just react to it. But we don't plan ahead to sort of figure out like how to deal with it. And so it's in some sense this is a big metaphor, not only I mean in terms of like COVID, but also just dealing with climate change. Is that this has become a thing that oh, we can't do anything about it, but you can mitigate it as an individual, and that's the best we can do. And that's the best we can hope for. And what seems to be going on in Star Trek is the adoption of that kind of mentality in its storytelling, which I think takes away from the utopic possibilities that Star Trek holds out for us.
well, our response to climate change has been vote with your dollars. You need to go out and get rid of all of your light bulbs and replace them with complex fluorescent light bulbs. You need to trash your gas guzzler and buy a Prius. And what we have been brainwashed into not realizing is vote with your dollars is oligarchy. Um, and this is all totally related to my field, which let me wink to the hiring managers on my committee on advancement and tenure, um, because we could be using logical, rational processes. We need to realize the limits of them, and we need to make sure that we're addressing our emotional needs. And
Mm.
Roddenberry and every writer up until Voyager less so, uh, but up until the J.J. Abrams reboot of everything, were largely following a rational process informed by emotions, informed by the bounded rationality that we have, and engaging in all these techniques that were deliberative and thoughtful. And then all of a sudden it becomes really a much more shoot from the hip. And I think the problem a lot of people have with Janeway is that was Janeway may have been the biggest cowboy of all the captains in Star Trek.
Yeah.
So, which I get it. I'm not sure. Like it, there's some good storytelling in Voyager, but it's about logic and rationality, and that's what is missing so greatly from these future series.
Mm. Yeah, no, I tend to agree, and I think that it's sort of, in speaking about this, I'm starting to see more evidence of that, and it's starting to worry me a little bit. So I appreciate the way that New Trek is trying to deal with these kinds of issues in a way, but at the same time, I think that the writers, as you've been pointing out, are kind of boxed in by our own contemporary limitations. And aren't utilizing the resources of the Star Trek Utopia to think about like what would be different. They're portraying stories that make sense for people like us, but not thinking about, not using the science fiction framing as a way to be able to think about alternative solutions. Instead, they're relying on solutions that would make sense to us for stories that would make sense to us, except the setting is science fiction. So there's something missing in terms of, I think, it seems to me at least, an appreciation of the way in which science fiction creates that kind of cognitive estrangement that allows us to be able to open up our imaginative borders. That seems to be missing from what's going on with some of these new Star Trek series.
I think the profound betrayal that many Trekkers feel is they've broken the world building, and they've broken the world building so that they could focus more on contemporary issues, not realizing that it just the everyone's favorite episode of Old Trek with the half black half white people, um as stupid and like beat your head over, it was still within this world building context. It didn't break any rules. You had the prime directive,
Right.
and you had all of the things in place. So it was largely the characters responding and to reacting to a less advanced society,
Yeah.
which is why the story worked. But when we're dealing with the Federation being just as irrational as the half black, half white people, um, it it loses everything that we've thought to believe. And this is the foundation of genre fiction: is you create a world, you create the rules, and all the characters have to navigate within those rules. And the minute you break that, you lose some sort of authenticity, you lose some sort of connection, you lose some sort of believability. And that's what we're seeing here. And I think those of us true believers are trying to retrofit and try to make all of these infractions of the rule breaking somehow fit in, and we're trying to patch it back together.
Yeah, that's what it feels like for sure. I think that that's right. I think that that's right. Well, Jason, it's always a pleasure to examine and investigate the Star Trek universe with you, and to talk about sci-fi and its imaginative possibilities. I appreciate your time. So let me say thank you once again for showing up to talk about race and mental health representation in season 2 of Picard. I hope we can have you back to talk more Trek down the road, but appreciate your insights. So thanks for being here today.
My pleasure. So I could talk about, we could go for another 2 hours.
I know. Well, thanks for being here, and thank you all for paying attention and being here with us too. You can find the Anarres Project for Alternative Futures on a variety of different social media outlets. We're on Instagram, we're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, and you can find this podcast on audio version on Spotify through Anchor FM, or you can watch us on YouTube. And if you're interested in finding out more about us, send us an email at our webpage, which is anarresproject.org, or leave us some comments down below and let us know what you think about our takes on race and representation of mental health issues in the new Trek. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks once again, Jason.
My pleasure.